you. I hope that answered your question, Francisco. So we've got 3 more questions here. So the first one is from Joshua Burrow, who is asking, to what level will invasive species affect Antarctica, and how could ecosystems adapt for new species?
Wait, there's a big question. Well, to what level one, you can't give a straight answer to because all of Antarctica is different. We know, for instance, if you look at the sub-Antarctic islands, the milder islands surrounding the continent, we know that already 200 plus non-native species have been introduced by human activity. The figure itself doesn't mean a great deal, but on some islands, several islands in fact, there are more species of plant that have been introduced than there are native species. A proportion of those species, the obvious ones, things like Poa annua or something called agrostis, they are so-called invasive aliens. They're ones that spread out, they occupy the natural habitat, and they displace the native species. And they have a very big ecosystem impact. So you could argue they're very, very important. Things like grazing mammals, which obviously were deliberately introduced, there's no way they're going to get there naturally, have a very major impact as well. So hence the emphasis on eradications, things like the reindeer eradication and rat eradication going on in South Georgia at the moment. If you look further south, in the maritime Antarctic, there are probably 15 or 20 known introductions now. A couple of higher plants, a couple of higher insects, and then an increasing number of things like springtails and mites. We don't know what their impacts are as yet. But, I mean, if you're being frank, we know an awful lot about invasive impacts across the rest of the world. And in very simple terms, if you take 100 species to a place, 10 might be able to survive, one of which will become invasive. There's a sort of 10 times reduction rule. But if you take enough species, some of them will become invasive and they will displace or change the native ecosystem. So the impacts can be very serious. Bear in mind with Antarctic ecosystems, both the native ecosystem and the invaders are what we tend to call cryptic species. They're not big, cute, fluffy mammals when you get that far south. They're little insects, they're little nematodes or something of that sort. Things that we don't tend to notice. But they can be just as important in the way the ecosystem is structured and it functions. Now, the question as to how does an ecosystem adapt to an invasion, that's, again, it's a very good question. It's a very general question. I think I mentioned colonization is a natural process. In the Antarctic, we think that for every natural colonist event in the history that we've had in the region, the last 200 or 300 years, so for every natural colonization event in that time, there has been at least 100 human-assisted ones. And that gives you an idea of how important we are in this. Arguably, the host ecosystem doesn't adapt to the new species coming in, it changes as a response. Now, you may get to a position where you reach a new stable state with a more complex ecosystem. That's what you would generally expect. More species come in, more trophic interactions, more complexity. It is possible, for instance, if you, like as has been done on South Georgia and in Kerguelen, there are predatory beetles have been introduced there, carabid beetles that are very voracious. They eat everything in the way. And it's not entirely clear that anything in the native ecosystem can survive the presence of those beetles. So it appears that by putting those beetles into the system, we lead to a very unstable ecosystem. Where the beetles can get to, the native ecosystem is wiped out. Where the beetles can't get to, you get refuges where the native invertebrate fauna can survive.
Okay, thank you. And a question here from Julie Berkman. Were there Petri dish studies used in combination with the wind direction study to see what was being carried and if they would grow and live?
That is a very good question as well. Not in connection with that study. The study I put the slides up on is a very specific proof of principle to see whether we can use backtrack analyses to describe the pattern of connections. It's a very recent analysis that Tom's done. However, in the mid-1990s, a guy called William Marshall did do some Petri dish studies associated with similar backtrack analyses on Cygney Island. So seeing what was being brought up in the air was filtered through a filter and then attempted to grow things from those filters. And bear in mind, in those days, there wasn't the ability to do molecular analyses like there is now. There have been a couple of other very small microbiological aerobiology studies done on the Antarctic Peninsula and at Halley Station in Weddell Sea. David Pearce and Kevin Hughes have done those. And they do show input of propagules. At the moment, there are not enough studies done to be able to separate what might be a local propagule. So imagine if you do this on Cygni, yes, an air mass will come in and carry things, but there'll obviously be a source of propagules around Cygni itself. And nobody has yet really separated the local source of propagule from the long distance source of propagule. So there's a lot of work to be done. I should flag on this. I think there's an opportunity coming along, we hope. There is a group working within SCAR, it hasn't got a name as yet, that is trying to set up an aerobiological sampling network across the Antarctic, possibly associated with what's known as the ANTOS monitoring program, Antarctic Terrestrial Observing System, which is another initiative that is being set up under SCAR to try and more generally monitor terrestrial environmental conditions across the Antarctic. Those of you that know SEUS, it's the sort of terrestrial and nearshore equivalent of SEUS.
Okay, thank you. And then here's a last question from Vartika Singh. Not directly on Antarctica, but I'm sure you can answer it. And the question is, how is the biota of Svalbard getting affected by summer tourism in areas like Longyearbyen and Ny-Ålesund?
It's a very reasonable question. There is, as part of what was called the Aliens in Antarctica program, which was the program that documented the frequency of aliens being carried by humans into the Antarctic. There's a couple of very nice papers on that produced, particularly involving Stephen Chown, but it was a host of authors. There was a PhD student called Chris Ware who was based up in Svalbard for a couple of seasons. And when he came off the airplane here, he'd catch you or catch a proportion of you and hoover your pockets and clean your boots and all the rest of it. So we have parallel data for Svalbard. And it shows exactly the same thing in that humans carry a lot of things with them. Now, there is a difference between the north and the south. If you look in the south, so the Antarctic data I've talked about, we do seem to see quite a high number of biological invasions of what are actually sort of northern boreal species. They're northern weeds. We see very few invasions in the Antarctic from southern weeds, and there's a research question there for somebody because I've never had a good explanation for that. But most of the aliens in Antarctica are northern. Now, if we come to Svalbard, there are a couple of nice publications recently. Pernilla Iverson, I think, had one. Steve Coulson certainly had one on the invertebrates very recently. There are records of alien invertebrates on Svalbard, but on the face of it, much lower proportion